Hi, do you speak Sauk? Probably not. Sauk is one of the many dying languages of the world, and in 2018 there were only 10 fluent Sauk speakers left in a village of 110 people. One day, probably sooner than later, Sauk will become part of our many socio-cultural artifacts. And even though the largest languages are spoken by millions of people spread over vast geographical areas of the globe, most languages are spoken by a relatively little amount of people. The median number of speakers for the 6,912 languages catalogued by Ethnologue is only 7,000, compared to the mean amount of speakers of over 828,000. And according to research, these smaller languages seem to be more morphologically complex, while languages spoken by larger groups have simpler inflectional morphologies. Furthermore, languages spoken by larger groups tend to use more lexical strategies in place of inflectional morphology, often leading to larger vocabularies. The morphological and lexical complexity of a language can be better understood by looking at the socio-cultural compositions of a population. But first, let's just have a quick reminder so we have our terminology in order. Morphology refers to the set of rules governing the use of roots, inflections, and affixes. Units which may be smaller than the words themselves, but are large enough to mean something. So, leaf and leaves are still talking about the green things on the trees. Yet, by simply morphing the words, you add additional specifications. Lexicon, on the other hand, is all the words used in a particular language. Both morphology and lexicon can be used as a description strategy, where English uses lexical strategies to make something smaller, namely the little house. The Dutch use morphological strategies, namely het huisje. By adding je or tje, they make things smaller, giving the word additional specifications. Now, this beautiful graph right here by Gary Lupien and Rick Dale shows the connection between population size and inflectional morphology use, with the x-axis representing a measure of lexical devices compared to the use of inflectional morphology, and the y-axis representing population size. The dots represent the population mean of languages with a given complexity score, and the bars show a 95% confidence interval of the median. As you can see, languages that are spoken by a larger population have the tendency to be less morphologically complex. Research suggests this might be related to how social networks structure themselves at different population sizes, more specifically the heterogeneity and the homogeneity of a given population. This might be better understood by concepts developed by one of my favorite sociologists called Emile Durkheim. What he observed in 17th century Europe was a transition from one kind of society into another as a result of the division of labor. Rural societies, which he characterized by their mechanical solidarity, had a strong shared life history with a small amount of people engaging in high-intensity relationships. More industrialized societies were characterized by organic solidarity, where individuals share little to no life history. A society with a lot of members, but low intensity of relationships. Now, you don't have to remember the specific terms, but they give a good indication of the differences that appear simply as a result of changes in how the network is structured. These different network structures, in turn, can have major implications for the development of a language. Alison Ray and George Grace set out to investigate the social-cultural influences on linguistic form. They first distinguished between two different types of language contexts, esoteric and exoteric. Esoteric contexts, also known as intragroup communication, is communication between members of a well-defined group, who share a culture and an environment, general knowledge of the community and its activities, and who have a unified identity. You can see what this resembles, right? Mechanical solidarity. Exoteric communication, on the other hand, is outward-facing and conducted with strangers, that is, members of another group, or members of one's own group whom one is not familiar with, in the sense of not sharing their knowledge of people, places, cultural practices, or professional specialism, and so on. Resembling, you guessed it, a community of organic solidarity. So, why do these different language contexts have an effect on the structure of the language itself? Well, this is probably due to how esoteric communication in a closed community perpetuates. Strong shared knowledge allows the sender to implicitly encode a lot of information. This same shared knowledge allows the receiver of the communicated content to understand the message without considerable analysis. Furthermore, the language is often defined by children their acquisitional capacities, allowing for opaque and irregular forms. Contrarily, exoteric communication in open communities cannot rely upon this same shared knowledge, and they are thus required to encode information more explicitly. By making it easier to understand for outsiders, it also becomes easier for adults to learn. Over the generations, this puts an emphasis on more transparency and regularity. Therefore, interacting with more people can favor systemization by introducing a stronger pressure for generalization and transparency. A great example of this is the study of two young sign languages, ESL and ABSL. Both sign languages developed about 75 to 80 years ago in very different contexts. ABSL developed in small, relatively close communities with a high incidence of heritability of deafness, while ESL developed when people from different places got together over long periods of time, often in schools for the deaf, bringing together people from very different backgrounds. What the authors found was that due to shared knowledge, or lack thereof, the grammatical structure of the language developed in different ways. ABSL users often used this shared knowledge by pointing towards a certain direction to indicate a certain location, while ESL first had to generate a referential location, after which pointing, directing, or gazing could be used to a specific point in space. This referential localization was not always present within ESL. It is only within the third generation of ESL that we find widespread use of grammatical mechanisms for localizing reference and locations, and for incorporating these locations for the purpose of verb agreement. I can already hear you think, doesn't that only apply to sign languages? I mean, we can just talk about when and where, right? Yes, but when communicating with words, you'd be surprised at how much shared knowledge is implied. Think about how you talk to your best friend compared to how you talk to a stranger, about which words you use and which ones you don't. Now, does this definitely prove that homogeneity and heterogeneity are the driving forces behind morphological and lexical complexity? No, far from it. It is most likely an interplay of the size of the community, its geographical spread, the degree of language contact, and the denseness versus the looseness of the social network that affects the morphological and lexical complexity. And that is not even taking into account the life history of the language itself. So, to end where we started, the morphological and lexical complexity of a language can be better understood by looking at the socio-cultural compositions of a population. Furthermore, keeping this in mind when generating language evolution models is essential, seeing as information diffuses quite differently in these different social networks. Additional research into the different socio-cultural compositions of tribal clans might be beneficial, since the circumstances wherein language evolved are most likely within these closed communities. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm Lucian, and I bid you farewell.